Okay, we're on the bottom line of DAF Ayin Tesam at Bays. The Gemara is talking about a person who's known as the Sris Chama. He's congenitally sterile. And so the Gemara says, Hey Chidami Sris Chama, what is the definition of a Sris Chama? We just defined it as congenitally sterile. The Gemara tells us, Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Shelo Ra'a Sha'echas Bekashrusa. He never, in his entire life, had any virility. In other words, he's been sterile from birth. So Mina Yadinan, how can we determine this? And it'll be interesting because the Gemara may give us other criterion later. But one way of determining this, without looking at any other physical signs, is Amar Abaya Kol Hameitul Mayim Ve'eno Osa Kipa. When he urinates, the stream of urine does not form an arc that emanates strongly from his body and arcs upward and then downward. Rather, when he urinates, it dribbles downward. So that's a sign that he doesn't have the strength. Okay, so the Gemara now asks an interesting question. It says, Mimai Havai. Where does a person, or how does a person become this sris, this eunuch? In other words, if it's coming from something congenital, is there something that had to do with during his gestation and in utero that contributed to his being a eunuch? So the Gemara says, yes, it can happen because his mother did certain activities. She baked bread in the heat of the afternoon sun, so she's exposing the child to excessive heat. Okay, that's one thing, and also she drinks very strong beer, right? So there's alcohol poisoning to the baby, there's heat poisoning to the baby, and this is what causes the baby not to develop testosterone. Amar Rav Yosef, Hainu de Shamana la'ami, de Amar kol shimi me'e imo lakui velo yadana ma'inihu. So Rav Yosef says, now that you've given me a good definition of a Sris Chama, I can understand what Rabbi Ami was talking about, because he said that anyone who is afflicted from his mother's womb, I didn't know what he was talking about, but now that you've because I came in the middle of a conversation, but now that you've told me that this is a definition of a Sris Chama, I know I can deduce what Rabbi Ami was referring to. So now the Gemara asks, V'leicho shema hivri bein tayim. Why aren't you worried that maybe the person was healthy in the interim? In other words, we know that when the child was born, the urine stream did not flow properly, so we were able to determine at the time of birth that his urination was problematic. We're also able to determine now when we look at him that the guy's a sris, and the Gemara will talk about certain physical characteristics. He has there's certain characteristics of a sris as an adult, but the question is, how do you know that in the interim, maybe during a period of 20 years ago, the guy's 40 years old now, maybe when he was 20 he was virile, maybe when he was born he showed signs of sterility, and then, excuse me one second, Abi, I'm in the middle of the DAF Yomi shir. Okay, I'll have to talk to you later. Bye-bye. Okay. So the Gemara's question is, so how do you know that maybe there was some virility in the interim? Now, why is this relevant? Because the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Akiva, if he's a Sris Adam, which means that there was a point in his life when he was virile, he is in the parsha of Yibam v'Chalitza. It's only that if he was sterile his entire life, he's not in the parsha, and therefore if she falls to Yibam, to a Sris Chama, she doesn't have to get Yibam or Chalitza. So the question is, well, how do you know? Maybe the guy may present himself as being a sris today. He may have presented himself as being a sris at birth, but how do you know in the interim that maybe he was virile for a time? So the Gemara answers, "Kevan detchilas of a sofa lokoi lo chayshinan." The answer is that if at birth he presented himself as being sterile, now he presents himself as being sterile, we can assume that during that entire time he was as well. So you could, but there could be other nafkaminas as well. What happens if b'di'evet she becomes a Yevamos l'shuk? No. Does she become a zona? Like, in other words, or what if he has bia with her? Does he render her into a zona? So Masiv Rav Mari, Rabbi Chanina ben Antignos Omer, Bodkin oso shalosh pa'amim b'soch shmonim yom. So the Gemara says, but how can you say that just because he presented at birth and he presents now, you can assume that he was the same status all along? I'll show you that that's not the case when it comes to animals. With animals, there's a halacha that you have to give the bechor to the kohen. The kohen, if the animal is completely unblemished, brings it as a korban and takes the remaining portions of the carcass for himself. But once the animal develops a mum, the kohen can take the whole animal for himself and doesn't have to bring it as a korban. Now, the question is, what defines a mum? What defines a blemish in the animal? So the Brisa says that you have to identify a mum and go through 80 days of looking at the mum to verify that it's not a temporary defect, but it's a permanent defect. And so what do? You can't just look at the animal on day 1 and day 80, because maybe even though, let's say on day 1 it had a broken foot, and on day 80 its foot is broken, maybe in the interim it healed, and it broke again. So how do you know? So therefore the Brisa says that you have to examine the animal in the interim, like a Boker Tov, Sabach Ilchir. So that's why you have to examine the animal on day 40, so to speak, as well, somewhere in the middle, in order to verify that it didn't recover from a temporary blemish in the interim. So why don't you say the same argument over here? Make the argument that it's not enough just to know that he was sterile at birth and he's sterile now. Maybe in the interim he was virile at some point. So the Gemara answers, L'chad ever chayshinan l'kule gufa lo chayshinan. So the Gemara answers, no. When it comes to blemishes, when it comes to a mum, there you have to worry that maybe the animal recovered in the interim, because you're dealing only with one small portion of the animal's body. But a sris chama is a condition that affects the entire physiology of the individual. There's no testosterone in the body at all. And therefore, that's a condition that you don't have to worry that if you were able to identify it at birth and you're able to identify it now, you need not be concerned with the fact that maybe miraculously some testosterone temporarily infused itself within the person's body. That we're not choishish for. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Lo Ki V'chulei. So now we go, that was up until now we've been discussing Rabbi Akiva Shita, that a Sris Adam is in the Parsha of Chalitza, and a Sris Chama is not in the Parsha of Chalitza. Rabbi Eliezer says just the opposite. He says a Sris Adam is not in the Parsha of Chalitza, because there's no possibility for recovery from that condition. He's been permanently injured in his genitalia. But when it comes to a Sris Chama, since it's a medical condition that's congenital, there is a possibility of giving that person some kind of hormonal therapy or something like that, and allowing that person to become virile, and therefore he is in the Parsha of Chalitza. Or a Minu. Let's raise a contradiction from one Rebbe Eliezer to another Rebbe Eliezer, because it says in the Brisa, Ben Esrim Shana V'loha V'hevi Shtei Sairos Yaviu Raya Shehu Ben Esrim V'hu Hasaris L'choleitz V'lo Miyabe. So the first part of the Brisa says that if a man is once he reaches 20 years old and he has not grown any pubic hair, as long as they can prove that he's reached the age of 20, then he's identified now as a Sris, and he's not in the Parsha of Yibum or Chalitza. Bas Esrim v'lo hevia shtei sairos yaviu raya shi bas Esrim v'hi ha'elenis lo choletzes v'lo misyavem es divrei Beis Hillel. And then the Brisa continues and says that the same thing is true with the female. If by the age of 20 she has not grown any pubic hair, so then that's a sign that she's an ailenis, and therefore she's not in the parsha of Yibum or Chalitza. If she is married to the decedent and she falls for Yibum, she's not in the parsha of Yibum because she's not capable of reproducing. This is all according to Beis Hillel. It comes along Beis Shammai omrim zev v'zev b'nei shmona esrei. Rabbi Beis Shammai agrees in principle, but he says the age is not 20, the age for both male and female is 18. Comes along a third opinion, which is Rabbi Eliezer. And Oimer hazachar kedivrei Beis Hillel unekeva kedivrei Beis Shammai mipnei sheha'isha mimaheres lavo lifnei ha'ish. Rabbi Eliezer says, I agree with the principle that if a person is congenitally sterile and has not displayed signs of puberty, then they can be defined as a sris or an ailenis. But I say that the age is different for males and females. For the male, the cutoff date is the age of 20. If by the age of 20 he has no pubic hair, that's a sign that he's a sris. and by a female it's by the age of 18. That's the criterion to determine that she's an islandess. What's the difference? Because women mature physically faster than males, and that's the reason why there's a difference in age of 20 for the male and 18 for the female. The point is, says the Gemara, you see very clearly from here that according to Rabbi Eliezer, a Sris Chama is not in the Parsha of Yibum or Chalitza, because that's the premise of this whole discussion. This whole discussion is talking about a person who, from the time that they were from infancy, as they were growing up, they never displayed signs of physical maturity. Now, according to Rabbi Eliezer of our Mishnah, such a person is in the Parsha of Chalitza. And here it's saying that lo choletz v'lo miyabim, he doesn't do chalitz or yibum. So how can that be? So Amar Rami bar Dikuli Amar Shmuel chazabo Rabbi Eliezer. So Rami bar Dikuli says that it's very simple. Rabbi Eliezer changed his mind. So the Gemara's question is, Yiboyelahu mehei hadarbe. Which one did he change his mind? Did he change his mind from the Mishnah, or did he change his mind from the Bryce? In other words, in the final analysis, what does Rabbi Eliezer paskin? Does he paskin that a Sris Chama is in the Parsha of Chalitza, like our Mishnah says? Or does he paskin that a Sris Chama is not in the Parsha of Chalitza, like the Bryce says? Tashma, the Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Sris Chama choletz v'choltzen li'ishto shekein b'minon misrape in Alexandria shel Mitzrayim. So listen to the Bryce. The Bryce sides with our Mishnah. It says that according to Rabbi Eliezer, a Sris Chama is in the Parsha of Chalitza. Why? Because we do find that sometimes a Sris Chama can be healed, and we've heard of stories of where a person who's a eunuch from birth has gone to Alexandria and received some kind of medical therapy, and they've been healed and have become virile once. So therefore, that's the argument. This brisa stems with our Mishnah. So it's two texts against one text. So we'll take the two texts that say that according to Rabbi Eliezer, a Sris Chama is in the Parsha of Chalitza, and that's how we're going to paskin. So the Gemara now says, Rabbi Elazar Omer la'olam lo hadarbe. Rabbi Elazar says, no, you don't have to say that there's a machlokis here, and Rabbi Eliezer changed his mind at some point, but rather, v'chitanan hahi la'onshin. He says, this Mishnah, or this brisa that we just quoted, where Rabbi Eliezer says the cutoff is for a male is 20, the cutoff for a female is 18, he's not talking about Yibum or Chalitza. Even though that's the original machlokus between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, they're talking about Yibum and Chalitza. Rabbi Eliezer is not discussing that issue. Rabbi Eliezer is only saying, at what point can you determine that a male or a female is a sris or an islandess? The ramification is not chalitza, because I, Rabbi Eliezer, hold that even if they are a sris or an islandess, or a sris for sure, he's in the parsha of chalitza. But the question is, how long do you have to wait until you make that determination that a person is truly a sris? What are the other ramifications? Well, at what point is he considered an adult? As we'll see in just a moment, if a person does not display physical signs of maturity, then they don't have the status of halachically being an adult yet, and they're not going to be subject to onshin, to punishments in Beis Din, until they are physically and chronologically an adult. So therefore, according to Rabbi Eliezer, what all the brises is saying is that I hold at age 20, if the kid does not show signs of puberty by age 20, that nonetheless you treat him as an adult once he hits 20. And by a girl, once she hits 18, even if she has shown no signs of physical maturity, you treat her like an adult and she's punishable for her crimes. Itmar. Let's take a look at the next statement, which is related. Achal chelev mi ben 12 v'yom echad ad ben 18 v'noldu bo simon esris ulachar mikan hevi shtei sairos. Now, even though the language of this statement is written in the masculine, from a grammatical standpoint, Rashi says we are forced to say that it's talking about a female because of the ages. It says from the age of 12 to 18, if the person in question does not show any signs of physical maturity, of puberty, then what's the halacha? So Rav Amar Nasa Sris L'Mafreya, Ushmuel Amar Katan Hayaba Osasha. So Rav says, look, it doesn't matter whether they grow pubic hair after the age of 18. If this girl did not have pubic hair by the age of 18, then once she hits 18, then retroactively we say, she's an islandess, and she became an adult at the age of 12. And therefore, if we want to determine, let's say she committed a crime at the age of 13, is she punishable or not? So the halacha is, yes, she's punishable because legally she was an adult. Now, in the event that she grew pubic hair at 14, we would say no, she's not punishable because she wasn't halachically an adult yet because she hadn't reached puberty. But now that she's reached 18 and she hasn't grown pubic hair, this is a raya that she's not subject to puberty as a criterion for reaching adulthood, and we default to the age of 12, and therefore retroactively the avera that she committed at 13 was the avera of an adult. And Shmuel says no. Shmuel says there's no retroactivity. You only view her as an adult once she hits 18. But the avera that she committed at 13 is not attributed to her as an adult. She only becomes an adult when she hits 18. So Maskef la Rav Yosef la Rav. So now I'm going to challenge Rav, who says that you say retroactively she was an adult from age 12. Eilanis la Rabbi Meir Yehela Kenas. He says, what's the halacha by an eilanis? Now, so first of all, you have to understand something. There's a machlokus between Reb Meir and the Chachamim in Maseches Ksuvis about the law of rape, about the law of onus. According to the Chachamim, it makes no difference how old the girl is when you rape her. If it's an act of onus against her will, the Torah's knas stands. You have to pay her the chamishim kesef, the lo sihiyeh leisha. You have to pay her, and plus, if she wants to, you have to marry her. So comes along Rabbi Meir and says no. The halacha does not apply to a ketana. It does not apply to a bogeres. It only applies to a nara. She has to be legally of age in order for the laws of ones to apply to her, in order for the rapist to be chayiv the chamishim kesef. So the question is like this. Let's say a man rapes a girl at the age of 12. She hasn't yet displayed signs of physical maturity, and so we say, well, listen, the guy raped a girl who wasn't physically mature yet, so therefore he doesn't have to pay. But wait a minute, let's wait until she hits 18. If by the time she hits 18 she hasn't yet reached puberty, this is a sign that she was an ailanus, and retroactively the woman or the girl that he raped was of age already. And if that's the case, so then the halacha should be that he should have to pay her. And yet we know the halacha is that an ailanus is not according to the Brisa in Maseches Ksuvis, an ailanus is not entitled to the 50 pieces of silver. But according to you, Rav, she should be entitled to it based on the fact that retroactively she's an adult. So Amar le Abaye mikatnusa yotza leveger. So Abaye says that Rav Yosef, that's not such a kasha on Rav. You know why? Because according to Rabbi Meir, not only do you not give a kanas to a ketana, you also don't give a kanas to a bogeres. And an ailanus, you only give a kanas if you rape her as a na'ara, because that's the language of the Torah. So'akaha na'ara ha'me'orasa. She cried out. Right? So anyway, so the halacha is, only as a nara. The thing with an ailanus is that she immediately transitions from ketana to bogeres. By an ailanus, granted, says Rav, that retroactively at the age of 12 she becomes of age, but her becoming of age does not render her a naira, it renders her immediately a bogeres. And therefore, mimonavshach, when this man raped her, she was either a ketana or a bogeres, but she was certainly not a na'ara. And therefore, according to Rav Meir, she will never be entitled to a kenas, even according to Rav, who says retroactively she became of age. So Amar Lei Kol Kihani Mili Ma'al Yasa Yisamru Mishamoy. So Rav Yosef praises Abaye and he says, I hope that praiseworthy words like this can be one day said in my name. The Tanya, and I'll prove to you that you're right, Abaye, because the Brisa says, Ein Asris Nidon Keven Sorer Umore, Lefisha Ein Ben Sorer Umore Nidon Ela B'Chasimas Zakana Tachton. He says that a child who is a sris, reaches the age of 13 and does not have any physical puberty, cannot be judged as a ben sorah umora, because a ben sorah umora can only be punishable if he has reached physical maturity in his pubic hair around his genitals. Ve'ein ailanus nidonis kenara hameorasa shemikatnusa yatsa salaveger. And in a similar vein, an ailanus can never be entitled to the kenas of being raped. Why? because, and she's never judged as a Nara Ha'orasa, as a betrothed maiden who is complicit in a crime, if in the case of consent. Why? Because and there's no, and right, and the reason is because there's no such thing as a na'ara with an islandess. She's either a katana or she's a bogeris, and so therefore, Abaya, your thesis is confirmed by the Brisa. Amar Rebbe Avahu, Simone Sris va'islandess uben shmona ein osin bahen maise ad ben esrim. So there's the symptoms of a sris or an islandess, as we said, according to Basil, you have to wait until the person hits the age of 20, and then you say this is a sign that they're a sris or an islandess. And so this is confirmed by Rebbe Avahu, but then he adds one other, and therefore you cannot take any action against them as a sris or an islandess until they hit the age of 20, and it's only retroactively that you can reflect upon their status from before then. So now, and then the Gemara says, so this would affect, let's say, if a person, to determine whether this woman fell to Yibum, to the brother who's Sris, you can't determine that he's a Sris until he hits the age of 20. Once he hits the age of 20, then you can say definitively, yes, he's a Sris, and therefore you're not in the parsha of Yibum or Chalitza. So, and then he adds another halacha, which is, let's say a human being is born at the 8-month gestation phase. So normally we say that an 8-month-old term, the Gemara's understanding of the medicine of that time was that this child is not viable, and there's therefore a very good chance the child is not going to survive. And because the child is not viable, there are certain halachic ramifications of this person being considered a life or not, and therefore you have to wait until he grows up to be 20 years old before you can definitively ascertain that this is a viable human being. And it could be that there are ramifications to Yibum and Chalitza in this regard as well. So now the Gemara says, Uven Shmona Mika Chaye. Since when do we consider an 8-month-old even having a possibility of living? V'hatanya ben Shmona hareyu ke'evin v'asa l'taltalo, avol imo shocha lo v'umeni kasa. Look, I mean, even with the laws of Muktzah, which is only Derabanan, we assume automatically that as soon as the baby is born, he's not going to survive, to the point where we say that the child is Muktzah and the mother can't pick him up. What are you supposed to do? So, mipnei asakana, that because of danger to both the mother not nursing and the baby not eating, we allow the mother to bend over the baby and breastfeed that way, but we don't allow the mother to pick up the baby if he only was an 8-month gestation. So what you see from that is that even when it comes to rabbinic law, we automatically assume that the child's not viable. How can you tell me that you can wait until 20 and treat this person as a living human being, at least as a safek? So the Gemara says, Hacha b'mayaskinan kishenigmaru simanov. Well, there's two types of human beings that are born at the 8-month point. One is where, when the child is born, he displays symptoms of not having come full term. In that situation, we assume automatically the child's not viable. Whereas over here, we're talking about where the baby was born and the fingernails and the hair were completely formed. So therefore, we assume that the child did come full term, because the way the Gemara understands gestation in the womb is there are two types of babies. There are precocious babies who gestate at 7 months. There are regular babies who fully gestate at 9 months. But a baby who gestates at 8 months is not considered to be viable. Our understanding of medicine has changed. It could be because nishtanu hatavoim, that maybe nature changed, or maybe just there was a different medical understanding in the times of Chazal. But the point is that if you see a baby that is born at 8 months and has symptoms of being fully gestational, then this is a sign that the baby was really fully formed at 7 months and just hung around in his mother's womb. He was smoking a cigarette and just waiting to come out, and he waited an extra month to come out. The Tanya, Ezehu ben Shmona, Kol Shelo Kalu Chadashav, Rebbe Omer, Simana Mochichan Alav, Saro B'tzipornav Shelo Gamru. So, what is the definition of a ben Shmona, meaning a baby that you know is not viable, if he's born in the eighth month? And Rebbe says no. It says not only do you have to know that he came to 8-month term, but also simanim mochichin alav, that there have to be physical signs that this child did not come full term. which is the hair and the fingernails did not grow to the point where you would expect them to grow by a fully gestational baby. So taima de lo gamru, ha gamru amrina and hai bar zayin hu v'ishtahu yehu de ishtahi. That we assume, therefore, if the baby does have physical characteristics of having come full term, that he's really a 7-month precocious gestational baby, and therefore the child is viable. But you cannot treat him fully as a viable. In other words, there's still a suffix status on this person until he reaches the age of 20. But that's only when the child is fully physically healthy. But if the child displayed symptoms at birth that he was not fully gestational, so then you automatically assume, even when it's only a derabanan, it's not just a suffix, it's a vadai assumption that the child is not viable. So elahad avid rava tosfa uvda biisha shalach bala lemedina sayam viishtaya tresi archishasa ve'achshrei keman kerebi da'amar mishtaheh. So the Gemara says, but we have a question. You're basically telling me that this is a machlokus between the Chachamim and Rebbe. According to the Chachamim, we always say that if a baby is born at 8 months, we assume automatically that the baby is not viable, regardless of whatever physical characteristics, because we don't hold of this idea that the baby just hung out in the womb an extra month. But Rebbe is the one who argues. Rebbe is a das yachid, and he says, no, we assume the baby hung out an extra month if we see symptoms physically that the child came full term. Let me show you the following story, says the Gemara. Rava Tosfa once paskined, there was a woman in his neighborhood, her husband took a trip, a year-long trip. He was gone for 12 months. At the end of 12 months, he still hadn't come back, and the woman gives birth to a healthy baby. So the question is, who's the father? Right? So Rava Tosfa says the child is not a mamzer, because it's possible that the husband impregnated her 12 months ago, and the baby just hung around in the womb for an extra 3 months. He was dilly-dallying, and really he was fully gestational at 9 months, and just decided to hang around an extra 3 months inside his mother's womb. So the child really is not a mamzer. So the Gemara says, but the only person who holds that way is Rebbe. The Chachamim don't hold that way. The Chachamim hold that we don't assume that a child hangs out in the womb longer than he needs to. So how could Rava Tosfa paskin lekula to say the child's not even a suffix mamzer based on the fact that he paskins like Rebbe? Rebbe is in the minority. So the Gemara answers, Kevin deika Rabbi Shimon Gamliel da Amar mishtahi kerabim avad. The answer is that no, Rava Tosfa was not paskining like a das yachid. The very fact that there's another Tana who holds like Rebbe gave Rava Tosfa the confidence to say that now that I have 2 Tanoim that I've identified that paskin that you can assume a baby's just hanging out in the womb, we can paskin that way definitively. And what is the other one? It's Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. The Tana Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer Kol Sheshah Lamed Yom Ba'adam Eino Nefel. That is, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel had said that if a child hangs around for 30 days, meaning that after a baby is born, once he lives for 30 days, even if he was born after 8 months, this child definitively is not a nefel. And like Rashi explains, because what? Because we assume that he hung out in the womb an extra month. So even though this child was born at 8 months, once the child lives 30 days, this is a gloy milsa l'mafreya, that retroactively this reveals that the child was just hanging out in the womb an extra month.
Didn't finish learning.
Or he didn't finish learning, right? So anyway, the point is that Rava Tosfa sees that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel agrees with Rebbe, and as a result, he feels justified to saying that not only is this a das yachid, but I can paskin this way in a practical matter as well. But the bottom line is, says the Gemara, that if a child is born at 8 months and he displays signs of physical maturity at that time, so even it's only a suffix whether he's viable or not. Once he goes through 30 days, then you assume that he's viable, but there could be other halachas where you have to wait until he's 20, like we saw in the previous statement, before you treat him like a full-blown, viable human being. It's not clear from the Gemara what those nafkaminas are. It would require further analysis. Tanu Rabbanon. Ezehu sris chama kol shehu ben esrim velo hevi shtei sairos va'afilu hevi la'achar mikan harehu kisris l'chol devarav. So the Brisa now reiterates what we've known all along, that if a person reaches the age of 20 without having shown signs of puberty, so then that person is defined as a sris. And that's true even if he grows pubic hair after the age of 20, that's irrelevant. He still has a din of a sris. Ve'elu hein simanov. Now these are the signs of a person to determine whether or not he's a sris, which means, in other words, that he has to be, not only does he not have any pubic hair, but he has to be accompanied by these other symptoms as well. Kol she'en lo zakan, he has no hair, facial hair. V'saro lakoi, that his hair is very soft, and ubisaro machlik, and his skin is very tender. So it's like touching a woman's skin is the way that he feels. Reb Shimon Gamliel Omer Mishum Reb Yehuda ben Yair Kol she'ein meimav malin resichos. He says another symptom is watch him urinate, and if there's no froth that comes off the top of the urine, that's a sign that he's a sris. V'yesh omrim kol hametul maim vein osa kipa. Some say that, again, you look at the trajectory of his urine. If there's no arc in his urine, but instead it dribbles straight down, that's a sign he's a sris. V'yesh omrim, and some say kol sheshichva zaro doiche. Others say that you look at his seminal discharge. If his ejaculus is completely clear, that's a sign that he's a sris. V'yesh omrim kol she'ein meimei raglav machmitzim. And some say that if his urine does not ferment, which means like if you place his urine in a container and you leave it out for hours or days, and it doesn't start to become putrid, that's also a sign that he's a sris. Others learn that if he bathes in a hot bath in the winter, and when he gets out of the bath, you don't see steam rising up off of his body, off of his skin, that's a sign that he's a sris. In other words, his body is so delicate that it doesn't retain heat in the same way that a male body would retain heat. Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer kol shekolo lakoi ve'nikar ben ish leisha. And Reb Shimon ben Elazar says when you listen to him speak, you can't tell whether he's male or female just from his voice. You ever have that problem? You can't tell whether it's Joseph or Josephine. Person asks, speaking to a person on the phone, he says, "Hi, this is what's your name?" Leslie. So Leslie could be a man's name, it could be a woman's name, and you can't tell because the voice is a little bit deep. It's a little bit. So it's very, very awkward sometimes. Ve'ezu hi ailanis kol shehi bas esrim velo hivia beis sairos. That what's the definition of an isla? Same thing, like we said according to Beis Hillel. If she hits the age of 20 without any pubic hair, so then she's defined as an islandess, even if she grows pubic hair later on. But she also has to be accompanied by other signs. If she has no breasts, and it's painful for her to have intercourse. And Rishim Gamliel Omer kol she'ein lo shipulei me'ayim kinashim. Also, according to Rishim Gamliel, another symptom is that most women have like a little protrusion in their lower abdomen, just above their genital area, which is a sign that they have a healthy uterus, right? Just like a small protrusion. This woman doesn't have that. And Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer kol shekola ava ve'enu nikeres bein isha leish. And Shimon ben Elazar says if she has a deep voice, and you can't tell just by listening to her whether she's male or female. Itmar simane sris Rav Huna Omer achiu kulam Rabbi Yochanan Omer afilu be'echad mehen. So Rav Huna says, this is a machlokas between Rav Huna and Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Huna says, in order to be defined halachically as a sris, not only do you not have pubic hair, but you also have to have all of the aforementioned symptoms in order to be definitively defined as a sris. To, let's say, if you're a sris chamet, to be not bichlal in the parsha of yibum or chalitza. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no, all you need is only one of these symptoms, no pubic hair, and then just one of the other things. So heicha dehevi shtei sairos bezakan kuliyam lo pligi dachiu kulan. So now the Gemara says like this: if a person has facial hair, so then everyone agrees that in order to be defined as a sris, you need to have all of the things. You look at his urine, you look at the tenderness of his skin, etc. Then you need all of those things. But ki pligi b'shelo hevi. The machlokas is where a person has no facial hair. There Rav Huna says you still need to have all of these symptoms in order to be defined definitively as a sris. And Rabbi Yochanan says no, you only need one additional facet. So Elahad Amr Lahu Rabba Baravula Rabbanan Ainu Beber of Nachmani Besaro Male Hevel Esav Lebras. But one second, you see this. There's once a story about Rabbi Baravua who was worried about Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman apparently was he had certain effeminate qualities about him. And so he said, look, when he goes into the mikvah, look at him, look at the steam coming off his body. If the steam comes off his body, so then you know that he's not a sris, and you can give him a girl to marry. So what does that imply? It implies that even if he only has one sign of being a sris, then we assume that he's a sris. So kiman karavhuna. Or I'm sorry, just the opposite. That if he only has one sign that he's not a sris, so then he's not a sris, which means that in order to be defined as a sris, he needs to have all of those symptoms. So that seems to go like Rav Huna. So the Gemara says, "Lo, Rav Nachman sichi the dikna havyole." So the Gemara says, "No, Rav Nachman had stubble. He had a little bit of stubble or pores, demonstrating that he was in the process of growing facial hair." And as we said, in that situation, even Rabbi Yochanan agrees that he has to have all of the symptoms of a sris in order to be defined definitively as a sris. And that's why, in that situation, where he had the beginnings of facial hair, Rabbi said, you know what, as long as we can see that even one symptom he doesn't have as a sris, then we know for sure that he's not a sris. Now, let's go. Hasris lo choletz v'lo miyabim v'chein ailanis. The second part of our Mishnah was a little bit cryptic, because we brought first the machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer as to which sris is in the parsha of chalitza, which sris is not in the parsha of chalitza. And then the Mishnah said generically a sris is not in the parsha of chalitza or yibum. So the question is, katani sris dumya da ailanis. So what kind of sris are we talking about? Is this part of the Mishnah like Rabbi Akiva, or is it like Rabbi Eliezer? So the Mishnah says, the Gemara says, well, it compares a sris in this section of the Mishnah to an ailanis. Ma ailanis bidei shemaim, sris bidei shemaim. Just like an ailanis is a congenital condition, so too the sris that we're talking about is a congenital sris, meaning a sris chama, and ustama Rabbi Akiva damer bidei adam in bidei shemaim lo. And therefore we assume that the Stam Mishnah goes like Rabbi Akiva. In other words, this portion of the Mishnah paskins like Rabbi Akiva, who says that a sris chama is in the parsha is not in the parsha of Yibum or Chalitza. That's basically what the Gemara is telling us, that this part of the Mishnah is paskening like Rabbi Akiva, that a sris chama is not in the parsha of Yibum Chalitza. And finally, hasris shecholatz liyavimta lo pasla, that if a sris performs Chalitza, he does not render the Yavam apostle to the kahuna, even though Chalitza normally does pasel her for the kahuna, but his Chalitza is completely null and void, it's meaningless. But if he has bia with her, so then that bia renders her into a zona, because it's bia shelo b'makom mitzvah, it's her brother-in-law, it's an erva, and therefore that renders her a zona, she'll be usher to a kohen. So taima deba lahu ha'acher lo lema tihavi tiyufta derav hamnuna. So the Gemara says it only seems that if her brother-in-law has bia with her, he passes her from the kahuna, but if another person, let's say a guy from the market, would have bia with her, he would not render her into a zona. This seems to be a challenge to Rav Hamnuna. The Amar Shomeres Yavam Shezinsa Pesula Liyavama. He says that if a Yavama has illicit relations with anyone other than her Yavam, it's like committing adultery, and therefore she's usher to the Yavam. Now, if it's like committing adultery, so then she should also be puzzled to a Kohen. So the Gemara says, you're right. Lo, hu adin afilu la'acher nami va'ida the tana reisha b'didei, tana nama seifa b'didei. In reality, a woman who has illicit relations as a shomeres yavam, waiting to do yibum with anyone other than the yavam, that will render her puzzle to the kahuna. Why does the Mishnah only talk about the brother-in-law who has illicit relations with her, the brother-in-law of the sris having illicit relations? Because the first part was talking about the brother-in-law who's the sris. So the Seifa talked about the brother-in-law of the sris as well, but it's not to the exclusion of another person. In reality, even if another person who's not the yavam would have relations with her, he would render a puzzle to the kahuna as well. We'll hold it here for today. A good chodesh, a freilich and Chanukah.